This is the Prelude to Revolution
by Peralta
and Harrell. The Navigation Acts of 1651. These were acts passed by Parliament in October of 1651. The purpose of these acts were to give the government more control over the colonies, the rest of the world, and English trade. And this is a picture of the acts. Salutary neglect. This was the unwritten neglect that England had against the colonies. This violated the Navigation Acts because the acts were to end salutary neglect, and they continued. The Navigation Acts weren't heavily enforced by the king, and that's why they continued. The Proclamation of 1763. This was issued on October 7, 1763. The colonists couldn't go into the western frontier as an effect of the proclamation. This affected the people because they were excited and ready to be able to explore the western frontier, but then the proclamation prevented them from being able to do so. The Sugar Act. The Sugar Act forced colonial merchants to pay a tax of 6 pence for each gallon of imported molasses. This was a modified version of the Sugar and Molasses Act, which was about to expire and was passed in 1733. The Sons of Liberty. Sons of Liberty were a group of Boston shopkeepers who gathered to write a letter to the stamp officer from Massachusetts. This letter demanded that he appear at noon the next day to publicly resign his office. The Sons of Liberty ended up becoming a generic term for having pride in your country during the 18th century. The Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was passed by Parliament on March 22, 1765. This was a mandatory tax for colonists to pay that were used for defending and protecting American troops.
The Quartering Act. Parliament passes the Quartering Act on March 24, 1765. It required American colonists to provide housing to British soldiers. Colonists were not happy and would have rather given consent and be asked for permission rather than have their choice taken away completely. This was also a part of the Intolerable Acts. This was the actual document written by King George III, and this is an illustration of British troops barging into the house of a colonist. The Boston Massacre occurred on March 5, 1770. It was the killing of 5 colonists in a street fight between a patriot mob and British soldiers. This was caused by public's dislike towards the presence of British troops in the city of Boston. This is an illustration of the Boston Massacre. The Gaspee Affair occurred on June 9, 1772. It was a group of Sons of Liberty members who attacked the HMS Gaspee, a British customs ship stationed in Rhode Island. The British threatened to trial the Americans in England, but no arrests were made. However, the threat sparked protests due to the fact that they were informed via the Committees of Correspondence. This is an illustration of the HMS Gaspee sinking. The purpose of the Tea Act was to help the East India Company get out of debt. They were granted a monopoly on the importation and sale of tea in the colonies. And this is the East India Company seal and a cup of tea. The Boston Tea Party was a result of the Tea Act, in which a group of Sons of Liberty members disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians and boarded 3 ships in the Boston harbor. There they destroyed over 92,000 pounds of tea. The act of wearing Indian dress symbolized the colonists viewing themselves as American now and not British subjects. This is an illustration of the Sons of Liberty members dumping the tea into the Boston harbor. The Intolerable Acts were meant as a punishment to the colonists for the Boston Tea Party. These were a series of laws and a British attempt at regaining control over the colonies. The laws were the Impartial Administration of Justice Act, which allowed the royal governor of a colony to move trials to other colonies or even to England if he thought that the juries in those colonies wouldn't be able to judge a case fairly. The Massachusetts Bay Regulating Act made all law officers to be appointed by the royal governor and banned all town meetings that didn't have the approval of the royal governor. The Boston Port Act, which closed the port of Boston until the price of the dumped tea was recovered from the Boston Tea Party, and moved the capital of Massachusetts to Salem. The Quartering Act, which allowed royal troops to stay in houses or empty buildings if barracks were not available, and the Quebec Act, which granted civil government and religious freedom to Catholics living in Quebec. The First Continental Congress meeting was held at Carpenter's Hall in Philadelphia, where all of the colonies except Georgia sent delegates. Georgia declined because they were hoping for British help with a problem between them and the Native Americans on their frontier and did not want to upset Britain by sending a delegate. They met as a result of the British passing the Intolerable Acts and to discuss their rights. They wrote a petition for King George III, and their appeal had no effect, so they reconvened the following year to organize colonial defense. This eventually led to the Revolutionary War. This is an illustration of the First Continental Congress meeting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and this is an illustration of Carpenter's Hall.
All the other ones are like...